Okay, so we're finally wrapping up our unit on the Republic here. This is the last class period we'll have on it, and I think y'all are probably looking forward to that, right? We've been reading this book for long enough. You're probably getting bored and sick and tired of it. So all we have to do is get through today, and then next week we'll be starting on a new unit in which we read intensively a different philosophical work. That will be Descartes' Meditations, which is going to be much different in scope, much different in content, very different writing style as well, written almost 2,000 years after this book. So let's go ahead and start where we left off at 401D through 4. Where Socrates is responding now to Glaucon, agreeing that when it comes to the education of the guardians in the ideal city, they not only must have a certain musical training and literary training, but we also have to be sensitive to the kinds of images that they see in the city. What the buildings look like, what the paintings and drawings and embroidery and other artwork look like. And Socrates says, then aren't these the reasons, Glaucon, that musical training is most important? Could I have someone be Glaucon and Adeimantus? Would someone volunteer? Yeah? Okay. First, because rhythm and harmony permeate the innermost element of the soul, affect it more powerfully than anything else, and bring it grace, such education makes one graceful if one is properly trained, and the opposite if one is not. So we need to make sure that the guardians, remember, have only a certain musical education with rhythms and harmonies and melodies that are appropriate for the kinds of craft they're going to practice, combat, and then the crafts that they're going to practice when they're not engaged in combat in the city. Second, because anyone who has been properly trained will quickly notice if something has been omitted from a thing, or if that thing has not been well crafted or well grown. And so, since he feels discussed correctly, he will praise fine things, be pleased by them, take them into his soul, and, through being nourished by them, become fine and good. What is ugly or shameful, on the other hand, he will correctly condemn and hate while he is still young, before he is able to grasp the reason. And because he has been so trained, he will welcome the reason when it comes and recognize it easily because of its kinship with himself.
Yes, it seems to me that these are the goals of musical training.
It is like learning to read then. We become adequately proficient only when the few letters that are there did not escape us in any of the different words in which they are scattered about. This is a significant image that Socrates is bringing up again. Do you remember how he proposed we were going to find justice in the individual? Does anybody remember? He proposed we look for it in the city, but what analogy did he use? This was a while ago. It has something to do with letters. Let me know if this rings a bell for you. Socrates said, if we're trying to find justice in the individual person, it might be easily more found if we look at it in the city first, because the city is larger. Just as if we're trying to read a small word that's far away, if we can find that such a word is in larger letters and close up, then if we see that first, then we'll know what the far away hard thing is to see. Just as justice is easier to see in the city, once we see it there, then we can see it smaller, more compact in the individual. So he's bringing up this image again, which kick-started this whole activity that Socrates has been engaging in to try to find justice. And when we did not disregard them, either in a small word or a great one, as if they were not worth noticing, but tried hard to distinguish them wherever they occur, knowing that we would not be competent readers until we knew our letters.
True.
And isn't it also true that if there are images of letters reflected in water or mirrors, we won't know them until we know the letters themselves, for both abilities are part of the same craft and discipline?
Absolutely.
Then by the gods, aren't I right in saying that neither we nor the guardians we claim to be educating will be musically trained until we know the different forms of temperance, courage, generosity, high-mindedness, and all their kindred, and their opposites too, which are carried around all over the place, and see them in the things in which they are, both themselves and their images, and do not disregard them, either in small things or in great, but accept that the knowledge of both belongs to the same craft and discipline?
Yes, that necessarily follows.
So again, what Socrates is getting at here is that we're not going to be able to know how to educate the guardians properly to have these virtues unless we first know what the virtues are, right? So we're not going to know what kind of music we should produce for them and let them listen to, what kinds of stories we should produce for them and let them read and hear, unless we first know what the virtues are, because we're trying to base the stories on those things, right? There's a parallelism between knowledge of music and knowledge of virtue that Socrates is drawing out here for the ideal education. In Platonic philosophy, in the Republic and in his other works, it's important for you to understand that there are basically two ways in order that Plato does philosophy. In English, these words are translated as collection and division. So if you want to understand the truth of something complex, for example, the first thing that you might do is divide it into its different component parts and analyze all of those parts, right? If you're trying to understand how a motor works in a truck, you have to understand how all of the different parts, what they are like, and how they fit together. And then, once you understand the individual parts, you can collect them back up all again, and you have a more complete understanding of how the unit works, the complex thing. So in this philosophy too, in the Republic, we see Socrates analyzing complex things, dividing them up into their individual components and talking about them, dividing, as well as collection. Once we've analyzed those different parts, we can bring them together into a whole, into some kind of harmony that is going to give us a deeper understanding of the phenomenon we're trying to grasp. Then if the fine habits in someone's soul and those in his physical form agree and are in concord with one another, so that both share the same pattern, wouldn't that be the most beautiful sight for anyone capable of seeing it?
By far.
So here again, he's bringing up the idea that obviously the ideal person is going to be great in their physical respects and great in their intellectual respects. They're going to have their soul and their body united in harmony. And then this question is very interesting. I want to talk about this. And surely the most beautiful is also the most lovable, isn't it?
Of course.
What do we mean when we say beautiful nowadays? When you say something is beautiful, what do you mean by that?
Like pleasant to the eye, attractive.
Ah, right? Pleasant to the eye, attractive. This is kind of like our modern conception of beauty. But certainly you would say that there are paintings and works of art and other pieces of music that are beautiful, but are not that pleasing to listen to or look at, right? So it would seem like our modern conception is lacking something. This is important for us to realize because what the ancient philosophers like Socrates and Plato mean here by the word beautiful is something very different than we mean when we say something is beautiful. Normally we'll say a person is beautiful if they're pleasing to look at, if they're pleasing to the senses, if they're attractive. But that's not what Socrates and Plato mean, and the other ancient philosophers mean when they're talking about beauty. When they're talking about beauty, they're relying on an idea that what is beautiful reveals something to you. It's revelatory. Something that is beautiful reveals something to you. What do you think about that conception of beauty? Is it cool? Is it kind of confusing or mysterious? Think about it like this. In our modern day, how we tend to understand things and conceptualize things and phenomena is that they're distinct from one another. So, for example, if we're trying to talk about what a chair is like, what the properties of a chair are, we don't feel the need to bring into that discussion what tables are or the relationships between tables and chairs, right? We can just analyze the chair on its own merits. The same is not true for beauty during these ancient times. According to the ancient philosophers, the true, the good, and the beautiful are all connected to one another and interdependent on one another. That which is true is also good and beautiful. That which is beautiful is also good and true. That which is good is also beautiful and true. So when the ancient philosophers like Socrates here are talking about beauty, what they mean to invoke is this relationship between the true, the good, and the beautiful, and how these are all connected. So when we might say something like, a painting is beautiful, you might think that what we're saying is, the painting is good, and the painting reveals something true about the underlying nature of reality to you. When you look at the scream, you might say that painting is beautiful if you're following this conception, because not only was it created using an impressive, good technique, but also because it's revealing something about the human experience, about the human's relationship to the cosmos. What do you think about that? Does that make it a little clearer what they mean by beauty is revelatory?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Do you like that conception?
Yeah, it's like I think that's why people listen to classical music. Like when you listen to Mozart, like there's something like you know, nobody's I don't know if people like turn it on for fun, but like when I listen to it, it's like looking at like fine art, like it reveals it gets your brain to find something like deeper than what's on the surface.
Right. It's not the same as entertainment, right? We put on YouTube or Netflix to be entertained. But why do we look at art? It invokes something in us maybe we didn't see before, right? Invokes a perspective, tells us about how reality works in some way that we didn't see before, right? And so, Socrates asks, surely the most beautiful thing is the most lovable. Do you agree with him? Something that is beautiful, which reveals to you the underlying nature of reality, which is good and which is true, wouldn't you say that is the most lovable thing? Or no? No? Why not?
I think that love means like that. I think a lot of times the people that we love, it's never the perfect embodiment of actual what's like to be human. So I think it's like that. It's a lot of like the flaws that they have. That's what makes you love them. It's easy to love someone whenever like you're all perfect, but it's hard to whenever you're not. I think that is what comes from loving someone when they're not the stereotype of beauty.
Right. So let me play devil's advocate here. One of the reasons why we seem to love people is that they're not perfect, right? We love their perfect imperfections, it's kind of called, right? But what Socrates is saying here is not that what's beautiful is perfect. Could we say that the imperfections of someone does reveal something to us about the nature of reality? That something cool and wonderful can adhere in something that is imperfect, right? Because you love them anyway, despite their failings, despite their lack of knowledge. So maybe there's room here for your idea and this idea to still be compatible. What do you think?
Wait, so you're saying that your imperfections make you perfect?
He's not saying that. That's just a phrase that sometimes people use nowadays, right? I think it's from a famous rapper hip-hop song, right, where the artist is singing about this woman's perfect imperfections? Is it Usher or something? And so I'm just kind of trying to marry what you said about imperfection still being lovable with also what Socrates is saying here about beauty. Yeah.
What would be the term or phrase for something that reveals something like bad about the world?
That can still be beautiful, right? If you watch an amazing film, like let's say The City of God, which is a film that has a lot of violence, inequality, and chaos in it, you would say that reveals to you what Rio de Janeiro looks like for people growing up in the slums, and that's bad. But it's still kind of revealing something to you, right, about what that life is like, what that perspective is like.
But it's not good.
It's not good that they're living that way, but insofar as something is revealing something to you, wouldn't you say that is good? Like, because you're learning more, you're coming to a deeper understanding of the human experience. In a sense, I think the ancient philosophers would say something that exists, the fact that it has existence, makes it good in some sense. Which is a weird way of thinking, in a way, because there are bad things about life. There are things that we would call bad that exist. But you could imagine an ancient philosopher saying something like, something existing means that it is inherently better or more perfect than something that doesn't exist. Which is a weird way of thinking about it, right?
I agree with Socrates that so he's basically saying like the best, like the most fine habits in someone makes them the most beautiful. So like we would associate like someone who has like has good moral values and who reflects those moral values with their actions are the most lovable. And I would tend to agree with that. I don't think he's necessarily saying that we don't love everybody else. He's just saying
Right.
that people who demonstrate moral values through their actions and behavior is like that's the most lovable type of person. I would agree with that.
Yeah, when you think about the word lovable, think like able to be loved. It's easier to love someone who has their shit together, right? Than someone who is a mess. Would you all agree with that? So I think he's saying something similar here. Like the more beautiful something is, which is connected to how good it is and how truthful it is, the more something has those qualities, the easier it is to love it. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, if you look at like today's atmosphere, where you have half the country having this moral code, which makes them be on this side, and the other half has a totally different moral code, which will be on the other side. And I think it's very hard for those to love each other. You see the polarization of half the thing off.
Yeah.
Political scale, so I feel as if like in that time period, maybe, but I think now that's not necessarily true because humans have developed and we become so complex where moral and values has become really complex as well. But I think the homogeneity of morals and values back then was more prevalent than now. Because you have so many subsets of different things because we have different social norms and stuff like that.
Sure. Yeah. And well, people can also be mistaken too about, their judgments of other people and how they're living. I think one could make a case that even though the country is as polarized as it is, that most people have the same underlying values. Don't people want to be safe and happy? And allow people to live freely? We just disagree about what that looks like, right? Maybe? Although maybe you'd press on me a little bit and say, no, actually we do have different values. It is more dissimilar than you're making it out to be.
Well, I would say no. I think that most people they want people who share their ideals to live free. Like for example, like people who are pro-life want people in that particular realm to have the autonomy versus people on the other side they're not necessarily
Sure.
And vice versa, like people on the left don't want people on the right to do certain things as well. So it's like, I think that people are only care for themselves and the people who side with their views. And whenever you have something different, it's more of like it's like an attack on someone's human nature, which means that your point is invalid at that point, which means most people want you to shut up and not have a voice versus actually talking.
Right. Well, that's certainly how we interpret it, right? Yeah. And so I can see both sides of it. I could see somebody saying, well, actually, we all kind of have the same underlying values. And I could say somebody saying, no, actually, we don't, and fuck you. But let's continue on. A really musical person, then, would passionately love people who are most like that. But a disharmonious person, he would not passionately love.
No, he would not. At least not if the defect were in the soul. If it were only in the body, however, he would put up with it and still be willing to embrace the boy who had it.
I understand that you love or have loved such a boy yourself, and I agree with you. But tell me this. Does excessive pleasure share anything in common with temperance?
How can it? It surely drives one no less mad than pain does.
So a few things are going on here. One thing, there's a kind of a cultural tradition, cultural practice being invoked. I've mentioned this before, but back during the time of the ancient Greeks, it was quite common for an older male who is in politics to mentor a young boy and make love to them. Homosexuality was not something that was seen as weird back then between men. And I suppose even now the times are right. It's not really seen that weird now by a lot of people. So that's being invoked. But then also another thing is being invoked. Socrates says, or asks, does excessive pleasure share anything common with temperance? We would all say that pleasure is a good thing. But remember, the person who is going to be educated well and who's going to do their craft well, especially if they're a guardian or a philosopher king, has to have a certain character so that their soul, their mind, rules over their passions and their desires. So Socrates is saying, like, hey, pleasure is a good, right? But excessive pleasure isn't good. And Socrates then asks, what about any other virtue?
Never.
Then what about with arrogance and intemperance?
Yes, with them most of all.
Can you think of any pleasure that is greater or keener than sexual pleasure?
No, I cannot. Or the more intense one either. Or insane one.
Insane, interesting word, right? But isn't the right sort of passion a naturally moderate and musically educated passion for order and beauty?
Yes.
Then nothing insane and nothing akin to dissoluteness can be involved in the right kind of love?
No, they cannot.
Then sexual pleasure must not be involved, must it? And the lover and the boy who passionately love and are loved in the right way must have no share in it?
No, by Zeus, Socrates, it must not be involved.
So Socrates, I think, is actually criticizing a little bit this cultural practice. You might criticize it for a lot of reasons, right? You might say it's weird, right, for a 55-year-old guy to kiss and touch a 16-year-old boy, right? You might say that's pedophilic. You might also say, like Socrates is saying here, if someone does that too much, if they give in to their sexual pleasure too much, what that indicates is that something is wrong with their soul and their priorities. They're letting their desires and their passions rule over them, when it should be the other way around. And now he's going to make a staggering social claim. It seems then that you will lay it down as a law in the city we are founding, that a lover, if he can persuade his boyfriend to let him, may kiss him, be with him, and touch him, as a father would a son, for the sake of beautiful things. But in all other respects, his association with the one he cares about must never seem to go any further than this. Otherwise, he will be reproached as untrained in music and as lacking in appreciation for beautiful things.
That's right.
So there are two different ways you could interpret this. The one is that Socrates is saying this cultural practice is weird and shouldn't be done. You could interpret what he's saying here as being a critique of this pedophilic practice, you might say. Or if you want to assume that Socrates is saying this is allowable with a certain caveat, you could interpret him as saying, we shouldn't allow our guardians to engage in PDA. We shouldn't allow people in public to kiss and touch and make out and fondle one another. Because that might cause others to stumble. That might cause people to think that the two people engaged in this excessive makeout session don't have their souls properly ordered. What do you think about that? It kind of seems like he's advocating for outlawing excessive PDA, public displays of affection. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree.
Okay, so at what point, would it go too far and you would say, okay, none of that?
I think anything beyond kissing would be too far.
Anything beyond kissing. So
Maybe-
groping,
Yeah.
is that too far?
I mean, it depends on the context, because if
Maybe if you're dancing at a nightclub.
that's different, but anything beyond that.
Like people shouldn't be stripping their clothes off and fucking one another in the club.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? You would agree with that probably? Yeah.
I feel like I agree, that definitely, socially, nobody wants to see that. But I think there's a difference between, should it be allowed as a law versus, should you do it because of human decency?
Right. Yeah, we can distinguish what should be legal from what should be, looked down upon or not looked down upon. Right? Would a lot of you look down upon it if a couple just came in here and they were making out and slamming each other against the walls?
Yeah.
You would be like, that's weird.
Yeah, there's always that one couple in high school.
In the hallways, right? Slamming up against the lockers. One of them gets a concussion. No. What were you going to say, Kay?
Amusement parks where you're waiting in line for one ride and you have that one awkward couple that's just making out, groping each other. It's very awkward, very uncomfortable. Me and my girlfriend don't even do that. It's just don't do that here. Come on. There's kids. There's tiny people watching. What's going on?
You think it's indecent?
Yeah, I just don't like it. I don't know if it's just me. It's just I feel a lot of people feel that way, but it's just I don't know. I don't want to see y'all lip locking, groping. Save that for the hub, not here.
Socrates feels the same way. He's like, look, you shouldn't let people have sex in the streets. Certainly not that. He says they may kiss each other, be with each other, and touch each other, as a father would a son for the sake of beautiful things in public. But in all other respects, his association with the one he cares about must never seem to go any further than this.
Well, I guess I agree with everybody and with Socrates, but I don't think it should be obviously sex out in the street is indecent, but I don't think that affection should be something prohibited in the slightest, because like you said, it's one of those beautiful things, those naturally beautiful things about us. We're naturally attracted to people and want to be with people. So I don't think that we should halt our nature.
Okay, we just shouldn't let it, go too far. Let our sexual urges overcome us and pounce on people we think are attractive. Maybe we should outlaw that. Maybe that's assault, you would say, right?
Yeah, I agree with her. It's there is something really sweet about physical connection with another person, hugging and there's this quote in the Bible talking about when you meet your friends, you should kiss them like your brothers or whatever. So it's because people were getting when people get killed and stuff like that, because you never know when you're going to see them again. So there is something nice about that. But yeah, I agree.
And there's nothing sexual about that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So maybe outlawing and we do have laws sexual and that kind of stuff. It's so funny that amusement park thing. We all have that shared experience. People make out right in front of you right before you're gonna ride something that's either fun.
Yeah. Socrates knew way back then that
It was gonna happen.
it's not cool. All right? You don't go down to the agora, the marketplace, and want to see people, fingering each other or whatever it is. But let's keep going. Do you agree then that our account of musical training has come to an end? At any rate, it ought to end where it has ended, for surely training in the musical crafts ought to end in a passion for beauty.
I agree.
Now, after musical training, our young people must be given physical training.
Of course.
And in this too, they must have a careful training, which starts in childhood and continues throughout life. It would, I believe, be something like this. But you should consider what you think too. You see, I, for my part, do not believe that a healthy body, by means of its own virtue, makes the soul good. On the contrary, I believe the opposite is true. A good soul, by means of its own virtue, makes the body as good as possible. What do you think?
I think so too.
Okay, so this is an interesting question. Y'all have been to the gym, and you've seen people there who, are there 2 hours every day, working out, right? The gym bros, trying to achieve the perfect body and the 8-pack abs. Do you think that making your body as good as possible and as perfect and fit as possible is going to make your character as good as possible?
I mean, if you're Andrew Tate, you might think that.
You might think that, right? But if you're working out all the time, is that going to make your soul or your character perfect?
I mean, I think it just kind of depends who you are. But for me personally, if I'm going to the gym every single day, it might make me feel better, but at the same time, I like eating food too. What if food makes me feel as good as going to the gym?
Yeah? Yeah.
I think so. There are studies show that working out does better for your mental health than meditation, sometimes even therapy. That's how good exercise is. And number two, like a lot of people, especially men, whenever you do work out, it gives you this type of feeling. It gives you this confidence factor where you feel as if you are strong, you're like big and stuff like that. And that builds confidence. That makes you, that gives you like a type of it makes you gain the sacrifice that you really had before. I mean, you can ask any guy when they were living strong and whenever they started working out and bigger, it totally shifted their mind and how even people interact with them. It's also a deterrent of confidence as well. I've seen that personally, where people will want to do things until they see my size and they're like, oh, never mind. Overall, it's just like working out is just good. I mean, when you have people who are capable, that also feels responsibility. If you have the power to practically, like your body's a dead end at that point. You have the power to either protect people or harm people.
Yeah.
And so I think it's good for people to keep healthy and to work out.
Yeah. I think Socrates would agree and say that physical training is beneficial for your mood and it's beneficial for your mind. But he's making a claim about what we might call necessity here. What he's saying is that no amount of physical training is going to make you a perfect moral person, for example. You have to do something else psychologically or spiritually to fix your moral defects or to fix your priorities. And instead, he's saying the opposite is true. If you perfected your mind and perfected your priorities and perfected, becoming the best moral person that you can, the wisest person that you can, he says that would cause you to also try to make your body as perfect as possible. What do you think about that?
I don't know who said it, but I saw this quote one time, starve the ego and feed the soul. And I think that, in the context of, what they think is, virtuous, sure, confidence has a lot to do with that, but I think it's more of, being accepting of, what it is and who you are, sort of thing.
Okay.
Confidence is, a good thing to have, but it's not necessarily, the biggest thing. You don't want your ego to boast about everywhere.
Socrates would say, if you are too arrogant, that is a vice. That's not a good thing. And so basically what he's trying to say here is, if you craft the perfect body for yourself, that is not going to make you be the perfect spiritual or moral or wise person. But it is true the other way around. If you make yourself the perfect moral, wise person who has their priorities in order, then naturally you will make your body good. You will work out. What do you think about that?
Well, so that means people who are overweight or not fit, do they have a low moral ground?
They're not necessarily bad people, but what Socrates would say is that their soul is not properly ordered. For example, their priorities aren't right.
So my priorities are not right because I'm overweight? Like, I don't know how that makes sense.
Well, Socrates is conceiving of the soul as something that should be perfectly ordered towards a goal. And so, if he thinks that anybody is lacking in a physical way, he thinks that's going to be evidence that they're lacking in a priority spiritual way. Which you can disagree with.
Yeah.
You know? It is kind of a, hot take.
So is he basically saying, like, if someone, like, doesn't give themselves, like, enough sleep per night, like, they're being unjust to themselves, or if somebody doesn't exercise, they're doing themselves an injustice, essentially?
He would say that, yeah.
Well, I mean, that does make sense, like, if you don't let yourself rest enough, for example, you are doing injustice to yourself, because you're not going to be able to perform as well, if you were to get like, a certain amount of rest, or if you were to...
And think or plan rationally, right? Because again, he's got the way that you should organize your soul according to him is using your critical thinking skills and your capacity for reflection. So reason is supposed to be at the top. Reason is supposed to rule over the passions. And as long as you are ruling over your body and the rest of yourself using reason, you'll be able to get your priorities right, and then naturally you're going to live a healthy and fit life.
I think it's kind of a valid argument, and I think the reason we may think it's like not good is because it is like he's using the thing of like weight and exercise, which is like a touchy subject. But if you replace it with anything, which is like what it sounds like he's saying is like you have to have moderation and everything to like kind of like make this equal thing. So like what he was saying is like replace it with sleep or whatever. So like reasonably, to be healthy, you gotta get enough sleep. Or you should read, or you should spark your intellect and things like that. So like I think I kind of I think I agree with him. Is like that a good well-rounded, spiritually connected person with reason would put himself either in like a strong physical shape or enough sleep or
Ideally it would be all of it, yeah.
And like make it perfect. And so we all find like I think it's kind of like one of those things that just like calls everyone out. Like what is that part of you that's like missing or that you could make better for yourself?
Yeah, for example, Socrates would say about me that my soul is not properly ordered because I don't get enough exercise, because I don't get enough sleep, because I do have a craving for craft beer, whereas maybe I should be drinking water, or whatever it is. So yeah. And Glaucon says that he agrees that the properly ordered soul produces a good body through habits and lifestyle.
I was even like the stud guy who's like sleeping with 2 different girls every week. They would probably have the same critique that they're having too much sex or something like that. It becomes like an idol to them, and the only thing they're thinking about is sex. It's like
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if he's going to say if you're giving in too much to sexual pleasure, that's evidence that you have not ordered your soul properly. Like that shouldn't be the thing that you care about, and that shouldn't be the thing that's ruling your life. Okay. Then if we give adequate care to the mind, entrust it with the detailed supervision of the body, and content ourselves with indicating the general patterns to be followed, rather than going on at great length, wouldn't we be proceeding in the right way? Now, we said that our prospective guardians must avoid drunkenness. For surely a guardian is the last person who should get so drunk that he does not know where on earth he is.
Yes, it would be ridiculous for a guardian to need a guardian himself.
This is an interesting claim, right? The guardians are supposed to be the soldiers and the protectors and the policemen of the city. And the guards. guarding against external invaders. Socrates is saying we don't want our guardians to give in to too much of any of their desires. Like drunkenness, for example, we don't want our guardians to be drunk all the time. Would society be able to run well if our cops were drunk all the time? They'd kill more people than they do now, right? So it would not be good. And Glaucon calls this out. He's like, yes, it would be ridiculous for a guardian, someone who's supposed to be the protector, to need a protector themselves. Like, yeah, because they're supposed to play that role. What about food? These men are athletes in the greatest contest, aren't they?
Yes.
What's the greatest contest? What contest is most consequential in human life? Living, right? The combat arts, right? That is the greatest contest. We're not talking about discus here. We're talking about defending human life. That's important. Then would the regimen of ordinary trained athletes be suitable for them?
Maybe.
But it seems to be a soporific sort of regimen and unreliable as regards health. What does soporific mean? Anybody play Dark Souls or?
Oh no, I was gonna say that it kind of sounded like sophistry. So.
Oh, it's not going to mean sophistry. It means something like what I would rather be doing at home right now. In bed. Yeah, soporific means sleepy, sleep-inducing. And he's saying that the diets of ordinary athletes, like who run, who throw discus, who throw the javelin, whatever it is, it seems to be a sleep-inducing sort of regimen and unreliable. Or haven't you noticed that these athletes sleep their lives away? And that if they deviate even a little from their orderly regimen, they become seriously and violently ill.
I have noticed that.
Then we need a more refined sort of training for our warrior athletes, since they must be like sleepless hounds, as it were, who have the keenest possible sight and hearing, and whose health is not so precarious that it cannot sustain the frequent changes of water and diet generally, and the heat waves and winter storms typical of war.
I agree.
Wouldn't the best physical training then be akin to the simple musical training we described a moment ago?
How do you mean?
I mean a simple and good physical training, and one that is especially adapted to the conditions of war.
In what way?
You could learn that even from Homer. For you know that when his heroes are at war, he does not portray them banqueting on fish. Here, the footnote is important. Fish was a luxury item. Okay, you might think of it nowadays as caviar or a rich sauce or something like that. He's saying when people are at war, they don't have all these luxury food items. Okay, so we shouldn't get them used to those, even though they are by the sea in the Hellespont, or boiled meat, but roasted meat only, which is the sort most easily available to soldiers. For it is pretty much always easier to use an open fire than to carry pots and pans around everywhere.
Quite right.
That would be heavy, right? Take up energy, take up space. Nor, I believe, does Homer mention rich sauces anywhere. In fact, isn't everyone else who is in training also aware that if he is planning to stay in good physical condition, he must avoid such things altogether?
Yes, and they are certainly right to be aware of it and to avoid them.
If you think they are right to do that, my dear Glaucon, you apparently do not approve of Syracusan cuisine or complex Sicilian relishes.
I suppose not.
Then you also object to men having a Corinthian girlfriend if they are planning to be in good physical condition.
Absolutely.
What does Socrates mean here? Why should they not have a Corinthian girlfriend? What does the footnote say, Kay?
Prostitutes enjoyed an international reputation in the classical period. So they're prostitutes.
They're prostitutes. He's saying that the soldiers shouldn't be sleeping with prostitutes. Why? Do you think they had condoms back then?
Oh no, they did not.
So what would happen? If you slept with someone who slept with 100 other people that month, What are you likely to contract?
STD.
Right, yes. Yeah, you don't want your soldiers walking around with chlamydia and gonorrhea, whatever it is.
What if you have like a bunch of kids too? If there was no condoms back then? Unless you have like a
I'm
plan B or
presumably, there was pulling out and there was other, ways to prevent that. But he's saying, look, we don't want our soldiers to be physically ill, right? These sexual diseases, as we know now, not only affect the physical body, but, they affect your mood, your outlook on life, because, maybe you're anxious or insecure, whatever it is, because you have crabs or something. So you don't want your soldiers sleeping with Corinthian girls, all right? And also, to their enjoying the reputed delights of Attic pastries.
I would have to.
You can imagine in your mind here, the stereotypical picture of the cop who's feasting on his donuts, right? And he's got a big belly. Can't eat too many pastries, right? That's not good for you. Too much butter and croissants, whatever it is. And the reason for that, I take it, is that we would be right to compare this sort of diet and this lifestyle to the polyharmonic songs and lyric odes that make use of every sort of rhythm.
Of course.
There, complexity engendered intemperance, didn't it? And here it engenders illness. Whereas simplicity in musical training engenders temperance in the soul, and in physical training, health in the body.
That's absolutely true.
Think about this. He's saying that the poet guardian soldiers, policemen, should have a simple diet. Can we compare that to the kinds of diets that people have nowadays? When you go to the grocery store, what kind of foods do you see there? Do people tend to buy simple whole foods with limited ingredients? No, what do they buy?
Pop with like 20 different ingredients.
And dyes and processed things, right, that have high fructose corn syrup in them and whatever else it is. This is a little bit applicable to our day, right? As we've gotten better at food production, we've come up with all these fancy new recipes and ways of producing food and preserving food. But we know that stuff isn't good for you, right, if you eat too much of it. Same thing with fast food, which I was raised on, so I know what that's like. So maybe, there's some advice here for us today. I don't know. And as intemperance and disease breed in a city, aren't many law courts and surgeries opened? And don't the legal and medical professions give themselves airs when even free men in large numbers take them very seriously?
How could it be otherwise?
So not only is having an improper diet and an improper training going to be bad for the individual, but it's also going to cause social problems. Why? Because it's going to be a drain on the system, right? More surgeries, more hospitals will have to be opened to care for people. More law courts will have to be opened to settle conflicts between people. And this is a very interesting question. I want to see what y'all think about this. Could you find better evidence that a city's education is in a bad and shameful state than when eminent doctors and lawyers are needed, not only by inferior people and handicraftsmen, but by those who claim to have been brought up in the manner of free men? He's saying, can't you tell how good a society's education is by the number of lawyers and doctors they have? What do you think? If a society has more lawyers and doctors, does that mean that it's less healthy? Less ordered? Less just?
I mean, so like in the context of like the doctor thing, I think that like the more people you have, obviously the more doctors you're gonna need because disease
True.
is preventable, not preventable and stuff like that. But with lawyers, yeah, I think that is pretty evident of an unjust system almost. If you need more people to instill the justice and like clearly there's something going on that's making people not act the just way.
And settle disputes, right? If you need more lawyers to settle all these disputes you have in your city, Socrates is saying, well, that's indicative that these people in your city didn't get the proper education. They didn't get the proper moral education. They didn't get the proper social education. They didn't get the proper education in how to communicate with others to settle disputes. What do you think? Is he onto something here? Or is he just spouting nonsense? Do you...
You can say the same, like why do you have, like if you have like so many police officers and stuff like that, why do you need police officers or like stuff like that?
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
interesting, like if you see like a desperate need for jobs, then like what is causing that is an interesting question. Even with the doctor thing, like I don't know, like maybe you don't have enough medical researchers or something like that rather than doctors or something like that.
Yeah.
Who's
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's definitely like a good factor to look into, like a person's education versus like how the city behaves, but that it's not fair to say that that's the only factor.
Right. Right. Well, because some people, they have genetic conditions or things that aren't a result of their lifestyle or bad education. Right? And sometimes someone does screw you over and you just need to go to the law. Right? Because you didn't do anything wrong, but they did. So, maybe this isn't a hard and fast rule, but something like an indicator that something is going wrong in the society. Indeed, don't you think it is shameful and strong evidence of lack of education to be compelled to make use of a justice imposed by others, as if they were one's masters and judges, because one lacks such qualities oneself?
That is the most shameful thing of all.
So it's kind of shameful to rely on other people to, fix your problems for you, I guess. The idea being something like, if you had a truly just society where people were kind and loving and looking out for one another, you wouldn't have to worry about all these legal disputes coming up. People wouldn't violate the law. They wouldn't try to screw people over. And so, when you have a situation in which people are not being educated well, according to Socrates, they need to run to somebody else to fix their problems for them. That might not be because of anything that they did individually, but because of who they got screwed over by. But in any case, the situation indicates for Socrates a lack of good education. Education is super important for him, which is why we've been talking about it for a year. Exaggerating, of course. Do you really think so? Isn't it even more shameful not just to spend a good part of one's life in court defending oneself and prosecuting someone else, but to be so vulgar that one is persuaded to take pride in this and regard oneself as amazingly clever at doing injustice, and as so accomplished at every trick and turn that one can wiggle through any loophole and avoid punishment? And to do all that for the sake of little worthless things? And because one is ignorant of how much better and finer it is to arrange one's own life so that one won't need to find a judge who is asleep?
Yes, that is even more shameful.
What about needing the craft of medicine for something besides wounds or some seasonal illnesses? What about needing it because idleness and the regimen we described has filled one full of gases and phlegm, like a stagnant swamp, so that sophisticated Asclepiad doctors are compelled to come up with names like flatulence and catarrh to describe one's diseases? Don't you think that is shameful?
Yes, it is. And those truly are strange new names for diseases.
And of a sort that I do not imagine even existed in the time of Asclepius himself. My evidence for this is that his sons at Troy did not criticize the woman who treated the wounded Eurypylus with Parmenian wine that had lots of barley meal and grated cheese sprinkled on it, even though such treatment is now thought to cause inflammation. Moreover, they did not criticize Patroclus, who prescribed the treatment.
Yes, surely it was a strange drink for someone in that condition.
So he's saying, look, there's this thing that sometimes we give people now, or rather, it used to be given to people, and they could drink it and it would help them. But now if we give it to people now, it causes them to be sick. He's saying that indicates that the health of our society has gone downhill because now people are more fragile. And now what used to be cures in the past end up making them worse because their body is not working in unity with itself. Not if you recall that the sort of modern medicine that coddles the disease was not used by the Asclepiads before the time of Herodicus. Herodicus was a physical trainer who became ill and, through a combination of physical training and medicine, tormented first and foremost himself, and then lots of other people as well.
How did he do that?
By making his death a lengthy process. You see, although he was always tending his illness, he was not able to cure it, since it was terminal. And so he spent his life under medical treatment. He was doing experiments on himself, and with no free time for anything else whatsoever. He suffered torments if he departed even a little from his accustomed regimen, but thanks to his wisdom, he struggled against death and reached old age.
Fine rewards for his craft that was.
And appropriate for someone who did not know that it was not because of ignorance or inexperience of this kind of medicine that Asclepius failed to teach it to his sons, but because he knew that everyone in a well-regulated city has his own work to do, and that no one has the time to be ill and under treatment all his life. We see how ridiculous this would be in the case of craftsmen, but we do not see it in the case of those who are supposedly happy, the rich.
What do you mean?
Well, when a carpenter is ill, he expects to get a drug from his doctor that will make him throw up what is making him sick or evacuate it through his bowels, or to get rid of his disease through surgery or cautery. If anyone prescribes a lengthy regimen for him and tells him that he should rest, with his head bandaged and so on, he quickly replies that he has no time to be ill, and that it is not profitable for him to live like that, always minding his illness and neglecting the work at hand. After that, he says goodbye to his doctor, resumes his usual regimen, lives doing his own job, and recovers his health. Alternatively, if he cannot withstand the illness, he dies and escapes his troubles.
That does seem to be the correct way for someone like that to use the craft of medicine.
Isn't that because he had a job to do? And that if he could not do it, it would not profit him to go on living?
Clearly.
So this is a weird question. They're praising the person who does not take too much time off when they are ill, but rather continues to do their craft because it's adding something to the city, because it's adding good to the city. But that's not the kind of general view that we have of illness nowadays, do we? Nowadays we tell people, if you're sick, don't come to class. If you're sick, don't come into work. Right? Stay home and get better. So there are kind of a few different ways you could interpret what Socrates is saying here through a contemporary lens. You could interpret it as capitalistic rhetoric. You got to be working, got to be doing your job, got to be on that grind. Right? No time to be sick. Or if you have a more social or communitarian view, maybe you could interpret him saying something that is rather communistic. Hey, you got to do your craft for the people. Don't have time to be ill. Don't just think of yourself. So there are multiple ways to interpret this. But let me ask you, would anybody, for the jobs that y'all work, would you rather go into work and do your job, or would you rather stay home if you were sick and not go into work? How do you feel about your job at present? Do you feel like you're actually adding value to society? Do you get value from your work? Would you want to do it if you were sick still?
No, not my job, but school and stuff. I definitely think that adds a value to me as a person and what I could give to other people.
Okay, so you might show up for class if you were sick, but you don't love your job enough to do that. What do you do?
I work at my family's restaurant.
Okay. And you can deal with unruly customers, right? And people not leaving you tips. What about you, Kay? Would you go into work sick?
I called out on Monday because I was just like, I don't want to go in because my job is literally making me sick. They want me to work in this like storage room that's very cold, that has no ventilation. My allergies are messing up from all the dust, and on top of that, it's freezing cold inside of there. My job is literally making me sick.
You got to bring a jacket.
You literally have to wear a coat inside of your own workplace. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So, long story short, yes, I would call out. I don't care. But like she said, if it was for school-wise, no, I wouldn't do that. But for work, hell fucking yes.
Or maybe for something, that you actually felt like was adding to society in a way. Like maybe if you were helping others or, I don't know, tutoring someone or, painting a mural for the town hall that's being built or something.
No, I'm just fucking up people's credits.
Yeah.
It sort of is just like, it implies that the only value to a person is what they can contribute to a whole. And I think that like when he said like, if you're not going to be able to do your job because of like an illness or something, might as well die. That's like kind of,
yeah.
It's crazy because some people have like terminal illness that they're born with and can't control, or some people are just not as fortunate as others, and to say that they are not valuable to society simply because they can't like contribute to their certain class or job is like, it's just a little ridiculous.
It's kind of harsh, right? I don't think you're going to like what he says next then. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. It's like kind of one of the more messed up things about like our healthcare system is that like, I hear people even now, I don't even know if they know what they're saying, but they're like, we're spending, our own tax dollars on like helping people with healthcare, and stuff like that. I'm like, well, yeah, but there are people that have never been able to work, that their lives are valuable, even though, they can't show up to, a 9 to 5 or just a regular job and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Think about like if I broke both of my arms, I wouldn't be able to serve my restaurant. Does that make my life invaluable? Which is kind of like whack.
Yeah. Well, listen to what he says next. Hold on, let's keep going. But a rich person, it is said, has no job assigned to him of the sort that would make his life not worth living if he had to keep away from it.
So it said at least.
What? Have you not heard the saying of Physides that once one has the means of life, one must practice virtue?
And in earlier time.
Let's not quarrel with him about that, but let's try to find out for ourselves whether this virtue is something a rich person must practice, and if his life is not worth living if he does not practice it. Or whether nursing an illness, while an obstacle to putting your mind to carpentry and other crafts, is no obstacle whatever to taking Physides' advice.
But by Zeus it is. Excessive care of the body that goes beyond simple physical training is pretty much the biggest obstacle of all. For it's a nuisance in household management, in military service, and even in sedentary political office.
And the greatest of all, surely, is that it makes any sort of learning, thought, or private meditation difficult by forever causing imaginary headaches or dizziness and accusing philosophy of causing them. Don't want to accuse philosophy of something bad on Socrates' watch. Hence, wherever this sort of virtue is practiced and submitted to philosophical scrutiny, excessive care of the body hinders the body. For it is constantly making you imagine that you are ill and never lets you stop agonizing about your body.
Yes, probably so.
This is what we would call hypochondria, right? Thinking that you have a disease or illness. I think that's what it's called, right? When you don't actually have it. Socrates is saying, like, if you're constantly worried and thinking about your body, like, you're going to develop, like, hypochondria, and that's not going to be good for anybody. Then won't we say that Asclepius knew this too? And that he invented the craft of medicine for people whose bodies are healthy in nature and habit, but have some specific disease in them? That is the type of person and condition for which he invented it. He rid them of their disease by means of drugs or surgery, and then prescribed their normal regimen, so that affairs of politics would not be harmed. However, He did not attempt to prescribe regimens for those whose bodies were riddled with disease, so that by drawing off a little here and pouring in a little there, he could make their life a prolonged misery and enable them to produce offspring in all probability like themselves. He did not think that he should treat someone who could not live a normal life, since such a person would profit neither himself nor his city.
Asclepius was a true man of politics in your view.
And this is the important paragraph, which we're going to discuss. Clearly so. And it was because he was like that, don't you see, that his sons too turned out to be good men in the war at Troy, and practiced the craft of medicine as I say they did. Don't you remember that they, quote, sucked out the blood and applied gentle drugs, unquote, to the wound Pandarus inflicted on Menelaus? But they no more prescribed what he should eat or drink after that than they did for Eurypylus. That was because they assumed that their drugs were sufficient to cure men who were healthy and living an orderly life before being wounded, even if they happened to drink wine mixed with barley and cheese right afterward. But they thought that the lives of the naturally sick and intemperate people were profitable neither to themselves nor to anyone else, that the craft of medicine shouldn't be practiced on them, and that they should not be given treatment, not even if they were richer than Midas.
The sons of Asclepius were indeed very sophisticated in your view.
So this, Socrates has made a few interesting points here that we can talk about. The first being, he says that you shouldn't try to treat someone who has a terminal illness because they're going to die anyway. And that's just a drain on themselves, making them live out a miserable life rather than dying. And it's a drain on politics, on social resources. He's not saying you shouldn't try to ease their pain, but he's saying there's no point in trying to cure someone who's incurable. Let them die. What do you think about that? Is that a little harsh? Yeah.
I think that in the context of the place that they're trying to build,
Yeah.
this isn't my own belief or anything, but yes, that's how it would be, you know, why would they want to make the medical care people work harder for people who simply won't get better? I mean, I think that people have value beyond the job that they can fit in this sort of class system. Because, looking at it like that, even if you were born into the class of philosopher kings, if you're ill terminally, you're not you don't have any value anymore.
If you're not able to do your philosopher king stuff, right? You're not providing any value to the city. A charitable way of interpreting what Socrates is saying is, look, trying to cure someone who has a terminal illness is going to prolong their life, and they're going to have a miserable end of their life. Just put them out of their misery. Let them die. What do you think about that? You're shaking your head.
That's just so fucked because it's just I know, I personally thank God because my mom had me young. But it's just if I were to imagine my grandma or my great-grandma or my great-grandpa going through something like that, it's a very bad terminal illness. I just I don't know if I would have the physical or emotional capability of saying, yeah, cut them off. I don't think I'd be able to do that. For me, that's that's fucked. That's super sad. But I can understand what Socrates is saying. I can see maybe the value somewhat politically, but morally, it's just that's shitty.
It rubs you the wrong way.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah.
Not to say this is exactly eugenic, but is this a similar type argument where it's certain people with certain diseases shouldn't reproduce? Is that kind of what he's saying almost?
What did he say earlier? In, what is it? 407 D5. However, he did not attempt to prescribe regimens for those whose bodies were riddled with disease, so that by drawing off a little here and pouring in a little there, he could make their life a prolonged misery, and enable them to produce offspring in all probability like themselves. He's saying this guy didn't do that, and he's doing something right. he is putting forth kind of a eugenicist thing. Yeah. How do y'all feel about that? That people who have certain really intense genetic diseases or disabilities should not procreate. What do you think?
I don't think that we have, like, we as humans should be able to tell someone that they're not allowed to procreate because we see their illness or disability as, like, wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I even think, like I think about, like, Jewish people under, like, Nazi Germany and how, like, they were, like, stopped from reproducing and, like, Hitler would have if they were pregnant, their babies would be aborted. And I think about, like, it gets really dicey, like, you could, you know, who's to stop this? Who's to stop the leaders from saying, like, this race or this religion is not allowed to have, reproduce because we see either their mindset or their,
whatever it is,
power.
genetics or...
Yeah, it's like one of those slippery slopes. And on that line of the thing, I think that I can see their mindset as, like, if it's physically hurting them. I honestly don't know my opinion about that, but I think about, like my grandmother has Alzheimer's right now, and so I'm watching her, and we have her on, like, medication that essentially stops her Alzheimer's from getting worse, but it'll never get better.
Yeah.
But, she still enjoys doing certain things. So,
right.
Like, while there's, like, costs that go into that, I see the value of, like, maintaining life, and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's also interesting because it's like the same reasoning we say eugenics is bad, but like we also have laws that say like cousins can't get married, right? Even though that would be the same thought.
Brothers and sisters can't get married, right?
And the same reasoning is because if they were, like their offspring would be messed up in a way, like they wouldn't exactly, like the genetics of it wouldn't be correct. Like there's just so many things that could go wrong. So like it's weird that we use that reasoning in that instance, but like when it comes to this, it's like completely opposite.
Right. There's something strange going on because on one hand we want to say we shouldn't like have a say in whether or not people reproduce. Like we shouldn't force people not to reproduce or like restrain them or restrain their liberty. But at the same time, we also think we ourselves have some sort of moral obligation to our future children so that we don't pass on any bad things to them. Right? So it's like these two things are in tension. All right. Well, that's where we're going to stop our reading of the Republic. Thank you all for making it this far. Next week, we're going to start going through Descartes' Meditations. So read the first meditation for Tuesday, okay?